and I was pretty tired after the fair, but had a brown bag lunch I was going to tell you about, steps of the post office again, but you know what? A wonderful speaker came in by the name of Bill Mueller. He was here last week, and he did a great program that so many people enjoyed. Got so many comments about his book that he wrote, Time to Ship Another Steer, but he wrote another book, and he came in this morning only to drop off some books, and Dixie twisted his arm, and we got him to agree to do another brown bag lunch for us. So he's going to tell you some driver's ed stories, he's going to tell you all kinds of things. I tried to get a hold of Clover Ridge because he's got Jack Marlowe and a whole following over there, but they didn't answer their phone. So I couldn't get the word to them. But I know you're going to enjoy listening to him much more than you would have enjoyed listening to me. So I appreciate the fact that he's willing to do this for us, and he didn't know until 45 minutes ago. We really twisted his arm, and he agreed to do brown bag lunch today. So here he is. So thank you very much for that.
Well, this is really unusual for me. Not that I talk, because I talk all the time. But, in fact, when I was little, my dad, 10 siblings, we worked with my dad on the farm all the time. And I used to drive him nuts with my questions. I asked more questions than the rest of my siblings all put together. But you know, when I do a talk, people say, well, you were a teacher, it's easy for you to make it look pretty easy. Well, what people don't understand is every time I give a talk, I practice that talk 5, 6, 7 times. Sometimes it's when I speak at a civic group, they only want 15 minutes because they got to get back to work. And then usually libraries, museums, they want 45 minutes. And then sometimes they're in between, maybe 30 minutes. And my wife prefers 15 minutes because she's only heard them a million times. But so I'm just ad-libbing it today. I think I'll share maybe some stories about family, maybe that I didn't include maybe just last week. And then I've got some really fun stories in my first book. I think you guys will really, really enjoy. But I was number 5 of 11, and my dad was, I think I mentioned, was in the Aleutian Islands for 3.5 years during World War II. He was up by Russia. He was over 1,000 miles from Anchorage, Alaska. Never came home for 3 years. Never saw a woman for 3.5 years. Never saw a woman for 3.5 years. Well, in the meantime, my mom and dad had only dated just a few times, and Mom would go to my dad's mother's to help her, because neither one of my grandmothers ever drove. So Dad would go to Grandma's and help her out, run errands for her, take her places. So even though my dad was far away in World War II, my mother and my grandmother became very close. And one time my grandmother writes a letter to my dad and says, "You better," because my dad is a young man, he dated quite a bit, and she writes this letter to my dad, my grandmother, and she says, "You better not let this one get away." And I guess they say that my dad was a really good letter writer, but because he was the youngest boy, he had 5 older brothers, he was being told what to do all the time. So my dad, even though he was very, very intelligent, both my parents were avid readers. My mother was the most confident person I think I ever knew, and my dad didn't have a lot of confidence, but he worked all the time. And you know, having grown up with all these older brothers during the Depression, most of them got married late, so they're all still at home. So Dad felt like he had 5 fathers telling him what to do all the time. And his dad was 49 years old when Dad was born, so he always felt like his dad was more like a grandfather. And because back then, you know, people wore out. You know, when somebody was 65 years old back then, they were old. So my dad always remembered my grandfather as being old and never having done a lot of hard physical labor by the time my dad had come along. But I found out, maybe I told you this last week, my grandfather, you know, he came over from Germany, hopped on the boat instead of going into the army like he was supposed to, and he loved America because he raised draft horses. Well, I was talking to somebody a couple weeks ago, and I never knew this before, until just a couple weeks ago. Somebody told me that for a person to be able to raise and train draft horses, a team is 2 horses. And he used to sell 2 to 3 teams every year. And somebody had told me just a couple weeks ago that that was almost like being an artisan or being a craftsman of some sort, having the skill to be able to raise these horses, to be able to do all the work that farmers required of them. And the thing, and he sold horses until 1936. By that point, tractors had pretty much taken over. And my dad had always had a dream of maybe someday having a pair of draft horses, but because there was 11 of us and my folks always worked so hard, we never had any draft horses. We did have a couple of horses when I was a kid. My dad kind of had the attitude, if you couldn't eat it or you couldn't sell it, what's the point of a horse? And then we did have a guy that he boarded a couple horses at our place for several years, and he had this one. It was wasn't an Arabian. It was a horse that was supposed to spot, but it never spotted. It was a fancy horse, and it was a stallion. So he had this horse at our place that was a stallion, and then he had another horse that was a real calm second horse, and he had 3 sons. His 3 sons were scared to death of horses, but this guy would board them at our place. And he would go to the horse shows. He'd put Vicks in the horse's nose so it could never smell any of the mares. And this is a wild horse, and this guy used to ride this stallion. And one time he was on vacation. When he was on vacation, my brother and Mark and I were always, he'd pay us to take care of his horse. Well, one day I'm in the stall trying to get this horse to move over, and thankfully at the time the horse didn't have any shoes on. But he hit me in the leg, he kicked me in the leg, and I thought for sure he broke my leg. And today I look back and I'm so thankful he didn't hit me about 6 inches higher north, or I'd have been in real trouble. We just, my dad always, like I said, my folks always had people coming to visit. Mom had a coffee, even after, while she was on hospice, she still had a coffee every 2 weeks on a Saturday morning. And sometimes we'd get 15, 20 people would be there. Mom's younger sisters, a couple of them, their husbands are still alive, and some of the cousins would come over. And Mom and Dad, just, our friends, I had a friend one time, brother and sister, they used to love to come to our house. The sister, she told her brother, she says, okay, if we ever run away from home, we're going to the Millers. That's where we're going to live. And then his brothers, her brother, a friend of mine, he said, I like it at Millers because they eat real butter. And we used to do fun things, we would take, I remember, talking about milking the cow and what a struggle that was when you were a little kid. Well, we used to do show and tell. We'd take a gallon of milk, and it was Guernsey milk. If you know anything about Guernseys, they don't produce what the black and white Holsteins do, but if you take good care of them, in the summertime, after they freshen, they have their calf, and they're on pasture, they're going to give over 4 gallons of milk a day. And one summer, Dad, for some reason, he didn't have any steers. He used to always buy calves in the wintertime, either Angus Holstein crosses, because they didn't have any value for dairy, and then steers. So we would always raise 6, 8, 10 steers every year. And then we would, one summer, for some reason, Dad didn't buy any calves that winter, so we didn't have any, all we had was the cow that summer, and the pasture really was going to require some repair on the fences and stuff. So that summer, we had this Guernsey cow all summer long. We had her chained out in the hayfield. We'd carry water to her, and then all summer long, every day we'd move her. She was on the edge of the alfalfa field. Every day we would move her chain so she'd have fresh alfalfa, and she used to sit. Like I said, when we were kids, each takes a half hour. This cow would stand there in the open field for a half hour while we milked her. If you can imagine a cow doing that. But they were so tame, and my dad always took such good care of them that they were great. He would, when he'd send his steers, it was always an easy task. If you had to ship anything, the trucker would come and the steer would walk right up in the truck because they were so tame, so used to people. We had this neighbor, and I wrote about him in the book. Mert Fink was his name, and Mert had a twin sister Merle. And they didn't talk to each other for decades. And they only lived a half a mile away from each other because they were always fighting. Well, thankfully for his kids, he got married late. He married St. Elsie. St. Elsie lived, they were just the farm to the north of us, and they dated for about 20 years. Finally, Elsie, St. Elsie said, "Mert, you're going to either marry me or I'm not going to be able to have children." So they got married, they had 2 boys. Mert was pretty old by the time he has 2 little boys. And thankfully today, they're both still alive and they're a lot better than Mert. But I started writing stories. When I started to write the section about Mert in the book, I write up a page on him, just telling some true stories about Mert. And my wife Audrey reads the article and she says, "You can't put that in the book." Because, I mean, Mert was evil. And my dad would always do deals with him. You know, he'd send his boar up to breed a couple of Dad's sows. Dad, we usually only had a couple of pigs, you know, to eat the garbage. And so then Mert would send his boar up, and he didn't need it, so Dad would spend all winter long feeding this boar for the neighbor. He'd do the same thing for a bull. You know, it was just, you know, he'd borrow our equipment, and we'd have to go into the manure pasture and fix whatever he was broke on it before we could ever bring it home. But Mert was just, and I'm not going to share it, but he was just evil. And one time my brother Mark was, him and a friend of mine who was a city kid, they were down visiting Mert. When we were little kids, we used to love to go visit Mert because he had the most colorful language of anybody I had to this day. And he was a horrible farmer, but his family at one time had a lot of money. So every 10 years or so, he'd have to sell off a farm because he was such a bad farmer, he would be so far in debt. And so anyway, he'd go, he was only milking about 30 cows maybe, and he had 6 names for all of his cows, so maybe 5 cows would have this curse word for a name. And then another 5 cows would have another curse word for a name. And this guy was just unbelievable. Well, he buys this Angus bull. And dairy farmers, they would, usually when a cow has her first calf, she's a heifer. Okay? And when they're young, they can't have a big bull because they could get hurt when they're breeding. So so a lot of times what farmers would do, on that very first calf, they would have the heifer breed with a Angus bull because they're a lot smaller than a Holstein. And then the calf would come out smaller, would be safer for the cow and the calf. But then those crossbreds really weren't worth anything. So Dad used to buy them from the farmers. A lot of times that's what we'd have. We'd have either heifer or steer of these black Angus Holstein crosses. Well, Mert has this Angus bull, and it had never, and he had this big pickup truck, big high sides, and this bull is rocking this pickup truck like he's going to tip this truck over. And they get it into the barn. Well, he's going to show, because like I said, Mert is evil. And he's going to show this bull who's the boss, so he decides to put a ring in its nose. Well, this bull is loose in his cow barn, running up and down the barn, and Mert has Everett is his hired man. Everett can't weigh over 100 pounds, and who knows how old this guy is, but he didn't have a lot up here, but he was really nice and he was fearless. And here he is with a pitchfork trying to persuade this bull to go in the direction he wants him to go. And the bull thankfully only knocked him into the manger. And so anyway, they get this bull who's going crazy, and they get it into a stanchion. They're going to put a ring in this bull's nose. So the bull is kicking like crazy, and they're putting the ring in. And I'll get back to, I said how we used to love to visit him because he of his language. My mom would always get upset whenever Dad would take us down to Mert's. And so anyway, in fact, Mert still owes me about $25 because we worked for him for a while when we were in 6th grade. So they're trying to put this ring in the bull's nose, and he drops the pin, and so he's got to go find one. So here Mark, he's got this bull, and it's an Angus bull, and its neck is way too big for that stanchion anyway, and plus they got a rope wrapped around it. And Mert says to Mark, he says, "Okay, hang on to this rope and don't let him get away. He's in a stanchion." So this bull's throwing himself one way, one back and forth, just going nuts. And pretty soon, while Mert is away looking for a pin to go in that ring, the bull all of a sudden coughs and drops over dead. Well, what had happened, so Mert comes running out, get the rope off him, you choked him to death. Well, what had happened, when it broke its neck. But Mike Chappie, this friend of ours, this city kid, we see him sometimes today, 50, 60 years later, almost not quite 60 years later, and he says, you know what? He says, that was the most terrifying experience of my life. So that's just one. His wife, his sister Merle, who he never got along with, you know, as adults, for a long time they get along, they didn't speak. Merle was, I mean, she also was as rough as a corn cob, never married, and she had 2 or 3, and this is back, cohabitation wasn't real popular yet, back in the 60s and 70s. Well, she cohabitated, and she had one, at least 2, maybe a third, of her boyfriends that died and left her everything. And Merle was, one time she was young, and she was parked in the field. You know, some people go back, by us in Kenosha, they call it going to the submarine races. You would go to Lake Michigan and park in a parking lot, and then you'd be in the car visiting, okay, high schoolers. Well, she is on her farm doing the exact same thing in a car, and the deputy sees these kids parked on this farm, so he figures he's going to chase them out. Well, he found out that Merle lived there, and she said, "You're harassing us, get out of here before I call your superiors." So just some of the neighbors, friends we had, we just wonderful, wonderful people. And like I said, our farm, our garden is 10 acres. And we spend weeks planting our garden every spring. And then we'd spend the summer, sweet corn was the main crop, and then raspberries, over 1,000 pints of raspberries we pick and sell every year. My aunts would come out and help. Most of the raspberries were picked by my mom, my sisters, and my one brother. I don't know if any of you have anybody in your family that thinks they're the smartest person in the world. Anybody like that? Well, I've got 2 brothers. I got 2 brothers that think they are. So it's kind of interesting because neither one of them realizes that all 5 of my sisters are smarter than both of them. But this one brother was so stubborn that mom and dad really had trouble getting, so he wasn't very handy. IQ-wise, he's pretty smart, but the rest of us boys were all pretty handy, and we could pretty much do, you know, I got 3 brothers that can figure out anything. They're that handy. And then I've got 2 brothers that can't do anything. And I always tell people I'm somewhere in between. Now, my mother was just, was so much fun. She, and I didn't tell you this in the talk, but her father died in 1942 of colon cancer. I think he was 60 years old. And my mother, about 20 years ago, my one brother went into the hospital. He had polyps, so mom insisted all 11 of us kids get colonoscopies. I've had probably 6 of them at this point. Well, mom was afraid to get a colonoscopy. This is something I didn't tell you the other day. Mom was having some health issues before their 70th anniversary, and every so often she'd have to go into the hospital and get a transfusion. Well, my mother used to play dominoes, no, not dominoes, yeah, was it dominoes? On Mondays, and then she'd play sheephead on Friday afternoons. And she would, every time she'd end up in the hospital, she'd probably be in there for a day, and then they'd send her home with instructions not to go or anything, don't go anywhere or do anything. And every time, over the last year she was alive, probably every, I don't know, probably this happened 6, 8 times over the last year or so before she went on to hospice. So, and what the problem turned out to be, she had colon cancer. And she went in to see the doctor. She's 94 years old. And my mother was so much fun. The doctor met her at 94. He said, you know, I have to do this. I have to do the colon surgery because of her attitude, the way she lives her life. He said, if I don't do it, she's going to die a very painful death. So I do the surgery after mom and dad's anniversary was June 1st, 2016, and then shortly after she goes into the hospital, and then she spends her 3 weeks or whatever in the nursing home. When she comes out of the nursing home, the first couple months were tough. I mean, think about getting over a major surgery like that, 94 years old. First couple months were pretty bad. Well, then she recovered, so by about September, October, she was pretty sharp again. So now she's starting to think casino. Because she used to, whenever she was in the hospital, they would give her a transfusion. They'd have to, she was always plotting, okay, how can I get to that? It wasn't dominoes. What's the other game people play all the time?
Solitaire?
What?
Solitaire?
No, whatever this game was on Mondays, she was always plotting how could she get to that game on Monday, or how could she get out in time of the hospital so she could get to her sheepshead game on Friday afternoon. Well, my mother used to be the person that would line up all these casino trips over the years, and when she was 75 years old, she won $2,500 in a blackjack tournament. And she didn't want to carry all that cash, and my sister lived about 45 minutes away, so about 10 o'clock at night, she's knocking on somehow she got a ride to my sister's. 10 o'clock at night, she's knocking on my daughter's bedroom window, could she let her in? And she left the cash, the $2,500, with my sister. Then my sister wrote her a check because she didn't think it would be safe to be carrying all that cash home on the bus. But she got to know the bus driver so well that he would always drive out of his way and pick her up with the bus in our front yard on the farm. And one time she was making a trip, and they had a blizzard the night before. Well, my dad would get so irritated, and so she wanted to go to. They had this casino trip planned, but the bus couldn't make it on our road, so the bus was going to stop at the mall a couple miles to the north of us. So my mom, in the worst way, is trying to figure out how is she going to get there. Well, Dad is not going to go out in the cold, out in 3 feet of snow, to start up the tractor to pull the car out to get it to the road. So she calls the neighbor. She calls the neighbor and she says, you know, can I ask you a favor? And this neighbor is probably, at the time, she's probably in her 50s, you know, and my mom says, you know, we got this casino trip planned, but I got to get to the bus. Can you give me a ride? Can you give me a ride 2 miles to the north to catch the bus? And the neighbor says, well, I'll try. So somehow the neighbor, she gets up there, and my mother is standing outside with her suitcase, standing in the snow with her suitcase sitting 3 feet off the ground on a snowdrift. Well, unfortunately, the neighbor was able to get her to the bus to make it to the casino. Well, then, when Mom went, I think I told you about how she said, if I die on this trip, I said that, shared that, didn't I? Take me to my sister's. My sister Mary's, to make it look like, did I share that or not?
No. Share it again.
Where she said, if I die on this trip, this is while she's on hospice. Oh, and so this is two casino trips before, while she's on hospice. And my sister Jane loves to gamble too, and she's a retired teacher. So she said to Jane, you know, if I die on this trip, take me to Mary so it looks like I was visiting Mary. And everybody that knew my mom would have known the truth. So Mom is, she is, you know, I talked about the lineup pictures. You know, that she just used to, and she was so much fun. My mother was just a card. She was a hoot. And you know, she had the bout with cancer in 1971. She lived another 45 years. And she just lived every day. Every day was to the fullest. So she's playing her sheepshead tournament on Friday afternoon, and she was 93 years old before she even, 92 or 93, she had only been in that league for a couple of years, and all these people in this league were amazed. This gal in her 90s is still looking for a place to play cards. So she is, on a Friday, they're playing cards, and she bumped her ankle, and her, you know, your skin gets real thin. She bumps her ankle, she starts bleeding. So they had to take her to the hospital to get stitches, and she was not happy. So then the next day, that's Friday, the next day she goes to a funeral of a friend and said, best party I've been to in ages. This is on Saturday. She passed on Tuesday. You know, and both my folks were sharp to the very end. They both died at home. And I fortunately, I retired from full-time teaching in 2010. And I don't know how far ahead of me Barb was, but I tell people now, I say, you know, I tell people now my favorite month of the year is August, when all the other teachers are going back to work. So anyway, I used to go home, a lot of times I go home and visit, you know, for 2 or 3 days at a time. And I do that every couple of months, just in the middle of the week. And we've always done a lot of visiting, a lot of traveling. I've always told people, you know, our family, we put our money into the gas tank. We spent a lot of time visiting my wife's family, my family. It's just something that's always been pretty important. And that's why I talk about how important it is to save those stories for your grandkids. You know, that's why I read the book. I didn't know there would be a market for it. Well, guess what? Anybody that's ever had a farm experience, you're in the book. You know, those stories are the same things you did if you've spent time on the farm. And so I go home and just pump my folks for information, and everybody else used to get so irritated because, you know, I was coming in to visit, so if I'm there for 3 or 4 days, or 2 or 3 days, you know, I'm just there to be of help if they need help. So when Mom would go to 6 different stores, because there was always a bargain over here, she'd get her meat over here, her produce over here. Yeah, I don't know if you guys know anybody like that, but that was my mother. And everybody else used to hate to take her shopping because it would take forever, where for me, it didn't matter because that was my only purpose, that and to ask questions. And, you know, I spent years pumping my family for information. And the title, Time to Ship Another Steer, you guys, if you guys know John Gilroy, his wife Christine is our editor, has become a dear friend of ours. But she is the one that recommended that title. You know, because I had told her earlier, I said, well, when you have a bill to pay and you have a big family on the farm, it's time to ship another steer. And she just thought that was so catchy. And so at the very last minute, we decided that that's what we were going to call the book. And it turns out that, you know, there's a lot of people out there that, you know, those memories, they're there. Man, save them when you can. Because every time somebody dies, those stories are gone. Okay? And, but as far as my dad was always working. You know, he never went to any of our ball games, except he did go to 2 wrestling meets. My older brother was 5 years ahead of us in school, and he was a real good wrestler. And at one point, his senior year, he had like 6 or 8 pins in a row, doing pretty good. And my dad goes to watch, and he gets beat. So my dad didn't go to another meet for 5 years, but he was always working. He had the farm, we had the garden. He had to put that garden in every year. He always had the day job. You know, we did the baling. We're always baling hand straw throughout the summertime. And so then the second meet, when my dad went to 5 years later, is when my brother Mark broke his neck. You know, that was the second meet my dad had ever seen, and my dad thought he was a jinx. So then when I, later on, you know, I went to Loras College. I wrestled at Loras for 4 years, and then I taught at St. Anthony's in Dubuque. And I was coaching St. Anthony's 7th and 8th graders. My folks came in for the weekend to visit, and my dad is in the gym at this wrestling meet looking at my wife and my mother for the whole wrestling meet, afraid to look at the wrestling because he was so nervous, because he thought he was a jinx. And so probably a real good thing that Dad was there when it happened. And I don't know, I don't want to get anybody, but I mean, it was pretty gruesome. What they did is they shaved, when he broke his neck, they shaved the side of his head, and then they put tongs in his head. And back then, they had the big circle beds, and then they would rotate you from stomach to back. Every so many hours, they put you back. And he was hurting so bad when they touched his arms, he couldn't stand the pain. But the first night, they had him in that, they put those tongs in his head. The first night, they had 55 pounds of traction. And the only thing holding those were those 2 tongs in his head. And like I said, when he left the hospital, the doctors and nurses, and all that information, everything I tell is in the book, but the doctors and nurses said it was a miracle that he ever walked again. And Mark is the one that he went to Platteville same time I did, and we were classmates for 10 years because I had flunked 3rd grade. So then when we went away to college, I mean, we didn't have a lot of clothes. I mean, the night before we left for college, we sat down with all our clothes and we picked, because we wore all the same clothes. You know, back then, well, you took a lamp and a radio and the few clothes you had, and that's all it took to go to college. Well, Mom and Dad dropped me off at Loras College, and Mark, they dropped at Platteville, and we both started school the same day. We both graduated the same day. So 4 years later, May 8th, I think it was, 76, I graduated at 11 in the morning, and then Mom and Dad go over, and we all go over to Mark's graduation at 2 o'clock that afternoon. So then the next year, my wife Audrey graduates, and my best friend John McLean from college, still a close friend today, and he graduates at 11 o'clock at Loras, and then we drive over to Platteville. Audrey graduates at 2 o'clock. Both of those days were hot days, and I might be a heretic, but you know what? If I never have to go to a graduation the rest of my life, I'm okay with that. But so then Mark and I used to hitchhike all the time, back and forth to Platteville, and you know, I'd come back in the morning, and people were working at the pack. Most of them were working at John Deere. They'd give you a ride, and some of these guys used to drive so fast, I would get back to school faster than if I had driven myself. And then, eventually, I met Audrey. My sister Jane and her were best friends. They were a year behind us at Platteville. And Jane's advice was, I dated a couple other friends of Jane's, my sister Jane's, and then I'd start dating Audrey. And my sister Jane's advice for Audrey was, be careful of Bill. And that's probably pretty much true. And even one time I used to hitchhike up to Madison. I had a buddy going to school up there, and during my time in college, Madison had 2 winning football seasons. And I hitchhiked 5 times up to Madison, because I never had a car. I hitchhiked 5 times up to Madison for the Badger games. And if you know anything about the Badger games back then, Camp Randall, people would shake, and that upper deck and that would move 18 inches in Camp Randall. And because they normally had such horrible teams, half the people coming out of the stadium never even knew who won or lost the game. But in fact, I even took Audrey with me one time. We hitchhiked up to Madison. And then when I'd come on weekends to Platteville, then there was a professor at Loras that lived in Platteville. I used to get a ride from him. But I worked construction through college. My dad was in construction. And back in the early 70s, work was pretty tight. There wasn't a lot of construction going on at the time, but fortunately I was able to keep employed, and that's what paid for all of my college. Our family, my folks put all 11 of us through 12 years of Catholic education, but once we turned 18, we were on our own, because Mom and Dad did not have the resources to help us with our college education. Well, all of my sisters and a couple of my brothers were pretty smart, so they had scholarships. I had some wrestling scholarship, because at the time Loras College was an NAIA college, but for me, most of my cost of college, I had to earn that myself. So that's what I did. I puddled concrete for 5 summers. After I graduated, even before I started teaching, I puddled concrete every summer, and it really helped me make that decision. I did not want to do that the rest of my life. My folks were tickled to death that Audrey and I were going to get married. Audrey was a farmer's daughter. They had 80 cows, they had 6,000 laying hens, and they raised a lot of hogs. I said the other day, Audrey was in the barn at 4:30 every morning of her life. And when she come home from school, if she did not have a school activity after school, she had 3 to 4 more hours of chores every day of her life. When she come home from school, that's...
I'm sorry.
My time up? Or?
No! Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. And it's even I apologize.
So my folks were so tickled that I was marrying a farm girl. Well, Audrey's family was, my folks, we were used to having people, stall, have flat tires, get stuck in the ditch. We lived on Highway 31, major road, so we always had people coming to our home and looking for help. And Dad's rule was, you get them back on the road as quick as you can. And my dad, in all my growing up years, it didn't matter if it was 10 below zero, it didn't matter the time of day or the weather, I never ever saw my dad take a dime, ever, to help somebody. But if somebody insisted, he'd say, well, give it to the boys. Well, guess what? 10 below zero, 2 o'clock in the morning, we didn't care, we were dressed and ready to help. Now Audrey's family was totally different. They were, if somebody was walking along the highway, they'd tell the girls, get in the house and lock the door. Totally different than the way that I was raised. And so Audrey and I were dating in college. We had been dating for over a year when we decided to get engaged. And her folks had probably met me 5 times. And I was Catholic. So my folks were not very happy, or her folks were not very happy when we decided to get married. And my folks were tickled. I mean, Audrey would come out in the summertime and help in the garden, and they thought it was so funny. Here's this farmer's daughter, and she didn't know how to pick anything, because she had never been in a garden. And so what we did is, now this is 1976, I thought, well, if her folks aren't going to support us, then we'll get married. I'll have a priest do our wedding. So we go to the priest, and you know what the priest says? You know what? If you really want your families to get along, how about we do this wedding at her church? And we did it with a priest and a minister in her congregational church in Emerald Grove, Wisconsin, which is 3 miles the other side of Janesville. Now, I mean, what a great idea. And from that point on, her folks were fabulous. But the reason they didn't like me was because first off, they thought I was a city kid. And also, well, I was Catholic, they thought I was a city kid, and they weren't happy. They just were not happy about that. But and then the other thing was, they put 2 years into her education, and they thought she was just going to throw her education away. That's one of the reasons they were not very happy. But Audrey and I both became career teachers. Audrey, there were no jobs in PE, so she went back, got her special ed at UD, and while I was teaching at St. Anthony's, and then once she graduated got her second degree, then she got a job in DeWitt, and that's how we ended up in DeWitt. And so then we did live in Makokata for 2 years, across from the parking lot of the middle school, the house, the little yellow house that the Hobsons owned. We rented that house for 2 years. And I taught at the Makokata Middle School for 31 years. And I think I mentioned last week, after 31 years, I knew I had to have something safer and less stressful than 8th graders. That's when I started teaching driver's ed. No, the real truth is, 8th grade was my favorite age to teach. And a lot of people look at me like I'm crazy. But you know what? If you're respectful of those kids and you are creative, you got the kid, you have them. If you're creative, you have them. And where high school I didn't like, because if a kid had given up, there was nothing you were going to do to help that kid. And I found that really, really frustrating. I never liked 6th graders because they were still poking each other and tattling. Well, now, even before COVID, that's now the behavior of a lot of 9th graders. Kids are 3 years younger than they used to be, emotionally, socially, mentally. Not mentally, but I think a lot of these kids, they just don't get out. They're living on their devices. I tell parents all the time, if your kid is 16 years old, doesn't want to drive, then how about you make them walk 5 miles once in a while, so they have an urgency. Thankfully, most 80+ kids can't wait to get their driver's license. So, what kid 16 years old wouldn't want their freedom? I have no idea. Okay, but over the years, as I mentioned, I've had over 8,000 students. I used to work for about 10 years after I retired from teaching middle school. I would work about 1,100 hours a year, evenings, weekends, and summers is what I did. But I loved being retired from the full-time classroom because I could do things in the daytime. That was the hardest part of teaching for me, was you could never, ever leave the building. And I found that really, after years, I found that really, really tough. But you know, the driver's ed's been a lot of fun. I mean, I've had half a dozen calls where I am a believer in divine intervention. We've had 5 or 6 times where several people could have been killed with what was happening, what people were doing. About 3 years ago, we were driving in, we're a couple miles south of Bellevue, driving into Bellevue, from Macoka to Bellevue, and we're about, I don't know, maybe 100 feet from a car approaching us, and the car is approaching us just as he's about 100 feet away, guy behind us passes us.
Oh.
I slam on the brake, and you know, those shoulders aren't real wide. And we've got a little white SUV coming at us. How that person ever was able to keep that car on the gravel, I have no idea. I don't know. You know, and he was so close to us, that crash, if it happened, would have happened right at our driver's door. You know, I had another student that he was the best kid I had, this is Davenport North. His name was Mitch Kelly. Best student I had in the class. He was just finishing his junior year in high school. This is May, he's on his 5th drive, his last weekend of driving. Best student I got in the class, he's a good driver. The teacher didn't have the mirror set right, and they're on Interstate 80, and all the truck traffic, and his teacher says, Mitch, we've got to get out of this lane. So Mitch, he doesn't look in his mirror. Well, what happened was he looks in his mirror, but he doesn't see anything because the teacher had the mirror set wrong. Okay, not all driver's ed teachers have the mirror set right. Okay, so anyway, he looks in the mirror, doesn't see anything, and he should have looked in the shoulder, but he didn't. He moves over at 65 miles an hour, they get hit by a semi. 65 miles an hour. Would that give you a scare? Well, here's the good news. The good news, because they're doing 65 and so is the semi, the car is totaled, but nobody in the car is hurt. Because they're doing the speed they should have been doing. Okay? That's the same thing. You come off of ramps. You cannot be coming off a ramp at 30 miles an hour. If you get hit, everybody in your car is going to die. Okay? And yet we see it. People coming off the ramp 30 miles an hour. You want to try to be up to speed, whatever that speed on the highway is. If you can get there, that's where you want to be when you come off that ramp. Because that, if you do get hit, you're probably going to survive. Okay? You know, other things, people ask me about roundabouts. You know, people our age hate roundabouts. Roundabouts are great. You know why roundabouts are great? Because nobody dies at roundabouts. You know that over 50% of everybody killed in this country in cars are at intersections under 35 miles an hour. Because they either got T-boned or they get hit head on. Roundabouts, what could be simpler than you wait your turn and you go right? That's it. That's it. You wait your turn and you go right. Plus, you don't sit for 2 minutes at a red light. They've had them in England. I have a sister-in-law that is from London. My brother Mark, that went to Platteville, she was an exchange student, and she's lived now 47 years in Wisconsin, but she's from London. They've had roundabouts in England for 50 years or more, over 50 years. But I had one kid one time, he was a horrible driver. He's 17 years old, horrible driver, and or almost 17, and he said, both my parents are horrible. They break every law there is, they speed, run stop sign, they do everything you could do wrong in a car, both my parents do it. But they both gave me the same piece of advice. What do you think that piece of advice was? The best thing, what is the most important thing you should know about driving? Any ideas? Yield? Anybody else?
Watch out for the other guy.
Watch for cops. So I'm giving a talk. It's prom time, and they're doing the car crash thing, you know, in Calwee, and this is years ago now. But so so they had me come in and talk for about 20 minutes on driver safety, trying to get these kids so that none of them get killed at prom. And so I asked that same question. and a kid, and this is 2 years after I had this kid, and I asked that same question. The kid in the front row raised his hand. He says, "Watch for cops." It was the same kid. Otherwise, I do want to read you one fun story, and I'm probably going over, but let me read one fun story I think you guys will enjoy. Everything in this book is true, except the story I'm going to read you and a joke I have in there. Okay? In fact, let's see. The following is reprinted with permission from a gift of attitude by Sam Glenn about an 88-year-old woman. Dear granddaughter, the other day I went up to our local Christian bookstore and saw a "Honk If You Love Jesus" bumper sticker. I was feeling particularly sassy that day because I had just come from a thrilling choir performance followed by a thunderous prayer meeting. So I bought the sticker and put it on my bumper. Boy, am I glad I did. What an uplifting experience that followed. I was stopped at a red light at a busy intersection, just lost in thought about the Lord and how good He is, and I didn't notice that the light had changed. It is a good thing somebody else loves Jesus, because if He hadn't honked, I'd never have noticed. I found that a lot of people love Jesus. While I was sitting there, the guy behind me started honking like crazy. And then he leaned out of the window and screamed, "For the love of God, go, 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 Jesus Christ, go." What an exuberant cheerleader for Jesus. Everyone started honking. I just leaned out my window and started waving and smiling at all those loving people. I even honked my horn a few times to share in the love. There must have been a man from Florida back there, because I heard him yelling something about Sunny Beach. I saw another guy waving in a funny way with only his middle finger stuck up in the air. I asked my young teenage grandson in the back seat what that meant. He said, "Oh, it's probably Hawaiian good luck sign or something." Well, I have never met anyone from Hawaii, so I leaned out the window and gave him a good luck sign right back. My grandson burst out laughing. Why, even he was enjoying this religious experience. A couple of the people who were caught up in the joy of the moment, they got out of their cars and started walking towards me. I bet they wanted to pray or ask what church I attended, but this is when I noticed that the light had changed. So, grinning, I waved at all my brothers and sisters and drove on through the intersection. I noticed that I was the only car that got through the intersection before the light changed again, and left kind of sad that I had to leave all of them after all of the love we had shared. So I slowed my car down, leaned out the window, and gave them all a Hawaiian good luck sign one last time as I drove away. Praise the Lord for such wonderful folks. We'll write again soon. Love, Granny. Anybody have any driving questions? Or just questions about my family?
No, but I wonder if your mom played bunco.
No, it wasn't bunco.
It wasn't bunco.
In a bridge,
No.
cribbage.
She just sounded like a bunco player.
I tell you, she never let anybody win either. She just, that just wasn't her nature. And she always talked about her father, who had, he had 14 kids, and he was a town clerk. So when he was dressed up in a suit, the kids could never go. If he wasn't dressed up, he took his kids everywhere he went. He just was so much fun. And he's the one that died at age 60 in 1942. And, I look back, if you had a time machine, wouldn't it be fun to be able to go back and meet some of those people you never had the opportunity? Well, you know what? We don't have that opportunity, but you know what? We do have the opportunity to figure out a way to save those stories. I guess I was fortunate. I ran into Christine Gilroy, and this is what she's doing. Today, she's edited and published over 30 books for local authors. You know, that's just her avocation, and she's just, but, so what am I saying to you? If you ever thought you would like to write your memoirs, you know what, if you know anybody that has ever run a school yearbook, they publish a book every year. That school book, that school yearbook is a published book. That person can help you if you know anybody that's ever published a school yearbook. Or put it on audio. You know, I talked about the Burks. We spent 10.5 hours, and I'm not a tech person, but all I had to do was push my button on my computer. Didn't even need a microphone. We would have needed a microphone, I probably would have been in trouble. But and I've got a couple other people that I'm planning on doing the same thing for. You know, but just, you know, how about we leave that legacy? You know, we all want to leave a legacy of some sort in our lifetime. How about your story and your parents' story for your grandkids? You know, really think of it. And I ended my talk last time. You know, wouldn't it be neat? How many of us really know anything about our great-grandparents? Not much. You know, I tell you, if you record those stories, your grandkids and your grandkids, they are going to know who you were. And wouldn't that be a blessing? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologize again for my phone. How could we not take advantage of something like this? It's so glad that you came.
It's fun. I enjoy it. In fact, since this book was published, this was the 50th talk I've given on this book.
Thank you very much.
Anybody wants the book, I've got books with me. I'd love to sell them. You know, I'll personally sign them.
Thank you so much. We'll talk about the post office another day. Thank you.